Welcome to How to Yu-Gi-Oh!
Historic infamous cards. Apoqliphort Towers.
Chapter 1.
Alright, and so in this video, I'm going to talk about Apoqliphort Towers, why it's an infamous card, and how it got its infamous reputation. With that being said, let's get on with the rest of the video.
Chapter 2.
And here we are. Now, I shall talk about Apoqliphort Towers, as you can see in front of you. To understand Apoqliphort Towers, you need to understand when this card came out. This card came out during the Pendulum era, around 2015-14, around the time period. Now, before Apoqliphort Towers came out, or the Klee archetype came out, the term boss monster did not exist in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Facts.
Sure, we had strong monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Shooting Quasar Dragon, which we had again, but again, Shooting Quasar Dragon was a card that you could only make with a Synchro Tuner. You needed Synchro monsters to make a Synchro Tuner, and then the Synchro Tuner on top of with other Synchro monsters. It was an elaborate way of making a really strong monster that required a lot of setup to take place. And you have to consider that when it comes to strong monsters in Yu-Gi-Oh! Before Apoqliphort Towers, they were extremely hard to make. And strong monsters, there was a balancing mechanic, which was the stronger the monster, the harder it was to make it, the more investment you needed.
Does not sound too bad.
But Apoqliphort Towers was the exception. When it was released, it introduced a mechanic that we're familiar with today. Let's read its effect to understand what it introduced into Yu-Gi-Oh! Cannot be special summoned. Requires 3 Klee tributes to normal summon / set. If this card is normal summoned / set, it is unaffected by spell / trap effects and by activated effects from any monster whose original level / rank is lower than this card's current level. All special summon monsters lose 500 attack and defense. Once per turn, you can make your opponent send one monster from their hand or their side of the field to the graveyard, their choice.
You can't handle this power.
So, and here you have it. First of all, let's look at it. And now that you've seen it, you realize what this card does. Right? First, so let's get this straight. It's a level 10 monster, requires 3 tributes, and is unaffected, right, by any level 10 or rank 10 or lower rank monsters. Which means you could not kill this card in battle, you couldn't kill it with monster effects, it was completely immune to everything. And remember, at this time, kaijus did not exist. And while yes, we did have Lava Golem, but again, Lava Golem, you needed to tribute 2 monsters. And I think we did not even have Santa Claus yet. Santa Claus didn't exist. So there was actually no way of getting rid of Apoqliphort Towers. And what makes it bad enough, it also had the ability, as you see there, to all the monsters that were special summoned lose 500 attack and defense. And another thing that made it absolutely ridiculous, you can see it's unaffected by spells or traps. So you couldn't even weaken it with spells or trap effects, right? You could only kill it in battle. And that made it worse as it made your monster weaker. So for the first time, a boss monster was created in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a feeling that we're all too familiar with Yu-Gi-Oh! Today. But when it was released, this was a feeling, Apoqliphort Towers gave the feeling of being undefeatable. You could not be able to beat it. You could only just lose. The feeling of, I cannot play the game. The feeling of, it's too strong. The feeling of, this is a situation that I cannot win. This familiar feeling, this familiar taste was given to us by Apoqliphort Towers. Is the first truly hated card in Yu-Gi-Oh! This card was hated as you could not beat it. There were no cards in the game at this point that could beat it. Santa Claus did not exist. Kaijus did not exist. Spells and traps could not get rid of it. You couldn't attack over it as it would make your monster weaker. There was physically no way of getting rid of it. Rank 10s did not exist in the game either. And if they did, well, they had lower than 3,000, they had less than 3,000 attack points. Not because of the effect of Apoqliphort towers. So there's that.
You don't get to play, you just lose.
And essentially you could crash into it, but if the opposing player had something on the field that with Klee's effects having a way of protecting it, there was basically no way to beat this card. And that's really all I've got to say about Apoqliphort Towers. A complete and utter boss monster. A disgrace to Yu-Gi-Oh! When it was released.
Believe it!
It truly epitomized what we hate about the game. And the familiar thing about it was used in very many cards that we see in the future. Its floodgate nature as a monster would be implemented and used in hand traps. This was the time we also got Drollin Lockbird was introduced into the game. However, it wasn't used. A lot of familiar hand traps, a lot of familiar floodgate-like monsters were introduced during this time. It would only be a few years later that they would get implemented and used, and we would see them do the same sort of playstyle as Apoqliphort Towers. So that is something that needs to be taken into consideration and something that needs to be realized. Apoqliphort Towers is the starting point of when boss monsters were created in Yu-Gi-Oh! As it is the original boss monster in Yu-Gi-Oh!
Final chapter.
And here we are at the overall conclusion. So what I want to say is that when it comes to Apoqliphort Towers, this is the original boss monster in Yu-Gi-Oh! This is the first monster in the game released at the time that could not be beaten by any card in Yu-Gi-Oh! It was a first in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, and it was a complete shift in Konami's design philosophy. Before Apoqliphort Towers was released, Yu-Gi-Oh's design philosophy was no matter what card you played, you could always beat it. No matter the strategy, no matter the monster, no matter how strong it was, there was always a solution. There was always a way to beat cards or a strategy. But Apoqliphort Towers was the start of true power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh!
From death comes rebirth.
And a lot of things that we are familiar with today, with hand traps, the negation side of things, and a lot of very familiar concepts that we are familiar with modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Today, were introduced all in one card, which is Apoqliphort Towers. So when we talk about Apoqliphort Towers, we talk about the introduction of a lot of negative things that players have had to experience in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it is important to realize this. This is where it started from. This is where floodgating truly started in Yu-Gi-Oh! Yes, we've had floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh! Before this. We did. The difference is they weren't front and center, and those were traps. Now, we did have floodgate traps, obviously, like with Vanity's Emptiness. That was used, and at this point, that was the only floodgate trap that was used at that point. Did we have floodgate monsters? Sure, but they were never used. They were never front and center. They were fringe ideas at best. But Apoqliphort Towers brought this into the spotlight. Konami brought floodgate effects to the spotlight with the Apoqliphort Towers. And it showcased to us as a community that floodgate monsters and floodgate effects are extremely powerful and can just realistically just steal and win games. And ever since, there's been a philosophy from Konami of building cards that just have floodgate abilities. It was been only till 2020 that Konami stopped printing negate cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Right? Especially for extra deck masters. While yes, we can say that people will say, yeah, but we do have other cards. But here's the thing. Since 2020, the production of negation, generic negation extra deck monsters is completely zero. There were no generic ones anymore. And while yes, we can say with Azamina we have one, but if we look at the rate of the creation of generic extra deck negates, we look at it now and they practically don't exist anymore. We are starting in 2025, and in the TCG, it's looking extremely. The game is looking completely different than it looked 10 years ago in 2015. In 2015, there was the introduction of this bad boy Apoqliphort Towers. It was the start of Floodgate Yu-Gi-Oh! And I can honestly say, in 2025, 10 years later, it is now the end of Floodgate Yu-Gi-Oh! As
Nice!
every single Floodgate monster is now banned. Okay? They do not exist. And there are ways of getting rid of Apoqliphort Towers now, which is why it has been left rampant in the game, as we have plenty of ways to just deal with it. And that's all there is to it. So tune in next time as I'll talk about more things on this channel. Hope to see you soon.
We come to the end of this video. So, as I like to say, you are one step closer to becoming a Yu-Gi-Oh! Master. My fate, right, is in your hands.